So we're doing the miniature version of a much longer lecture I have on building out a vulnerability management as a service practice for partners. But I think the most important part of vulnerability management is it's the value that you create as a provider. And when you sell that to the customer, it's really important to communicate what they are buying. And what they are buying is not a scanner that goes in a stack. So it is the act that you are managing their vulnerabilities. It's a thing people do. Um, you need software to help, right? But it's a process. So um, I'm going to go through some terminology, some concepts, high level. Hopefully, people watching can take this into their practices. So on the glossary side, I want to just touch on words like threat, exploit, and vulnerability, which are sometimes used interchangeably. But as the security advisor, the security expert, you should always endeavor to use the precise term so that when your customer hears what you're saying, it's consistent, but also so that they can understand, so they can be informed when they're seeing needs, right? They can associate those needs with what your value offering is. So when we talk about a threat, while again, sometimes people use these terms interchangeable, we're talking about the actor that creates a loss. So this could be evil dorm room hacker. This could be the Lazarus group in North Korea. This could be lightning burning down a building. Or in the case of something that happened at a famous EDR vendor this week, a human error, right? So that's the threat. Exploit is the action that threat actor uses. So it's the tool, it's the pathway that they take to impact that loss. Vulnerability is that place in your security architecture that the exploit can pass through. Now, I think that we've all heard these terms before about a vulnerability as a weakness in software. An exploit is sometimes thought of as a piece of code, right, that inserts like a key into a lock into a vulnerability. But more generally, it really is a verb. Those exploits, it's the act of getting into that vulnerability. It's not always a piece of code, right? So I can exploit my file cabinet, with a pair of lockpicks, right? Um, and then, of course, the asset and the loss. And I think uh, sometimes, particularly people in financial services, don't always understand what we're talking about when we say the word asset. But we're talking about anything of value in the information architecture of a customer organization, which frequently is things like laptops and servers and like machines, right? It could be phones. It could be, again, a file cabinet, right? It could be a person, right? And then a loss is usually a monetary amount, oftentimes theoretical, sometimes actual damage that happens to that asset. So that's the vocab 101. I'm curious, guys, in your practice, um, do you see people get confused by these? I mean, these are terms that insurers like toss at end clients, right? Um, do you see this is something that people can grab onto when they're being communicated value about what your protection is trying to do?
I think cyber insurance has really paved the way for a lot of these discussions with our end clients, whether that's a co-managed or fully managed client. But it's made it a financial responsibility on their part to be part of that and educated at least at a basic level on a lot of this. So it's becoming a lot easier than it has been the last few years.
Yeah, yeah, they've certainly been working to um, get people to understand how to get insured, right? And that because that's becoming harder, right? They need to educate their audiences. It's good for us, right? And of course, what service providers do is also good for the insurer. It protects their potential losses. So anyway, that with that glossary, we can now put together a picture of an attack chain, right? So a threat exploits a vulnerability in an asset. I think we've heard of that before. What some people sometimes, while they may have heard about it, don't think about too often is your assets are all over your network, but the asset that is initially exploited by an attacker is not frequently the asset that's actually the one that's subject to a loss. And an attacker breaks into one system through an account, through an open software misconfiguration, through a system that's unpatched, and then they move around, right? They escalate their privileges vertically, and they move around laterally or horizontally through a network until they find something that they can capture some value, right? And then so there's this chain, right, across an organization, which is sometimes difficult to envisage, but thanks to the Rubik's Cube there, you can see what an attack chain might look like. And if you break that attack chain someplace in the middle, you can stop the attacker from moving across the network. So this isn't just always about protecting the surface of a network or protecting the way an attacker breaks in. It's about making it difficult for an attacker to move vertically or horizontally. So in any case, your security surface is everywhere, right? It's not like the firewall or the outside of the network. It's really anything that can communicate with the outside world, which is just about everything, right? It's anything that reads email, anything with a web browser, anything that is pulling information down from the internet. It's pretty much everywhere. So the attackers can break in anywhere, and then they can move anywhere. And so to perform vulnerability management in an effective way, you really need to secure everywhere. You can't just look at the outside of a network. And then, of course, once you find those vulnerabilities, and this is where everything before that is stuff software can do. Find the vulnerabilities, maybe even map the network, maybe do some automated patching. But then once you have that list of vulnerabilities, this is where the humans come in, because the reality is things don't always patch themselves, right? Automatic patch management could be broken. Automated patch management may not have the patches that you need to solve that vulnerability. It may be unpatchable, and there may be something unpatchable or unfixable because the patch is either not out yet or that vendor's gone, doesn't exist anymore. That asset just needs to be retired because that thing's never going to get fixed. So a human has to get involved and make a decision, make a management decision, and either fix it or work with the end customer to accept the risk. Although it is reasonable for an end customer to accept an amount of risk, and this is where vulnerability prioritization can come into play, where you say, hey, if it's below this, we're not going to fix that. That's an accepted risk. If it's above this, we're going to do something like fix it or deploy a compensating control. And as an example, I'm aware of a car dealership, and they have dealership computers. And one of the things that happens at a car dealership is you don't get to choose the software you run because you sell cars. It's part of your franchise license. And that car OEM hands you your franchise software, and you just got to run it. And if that franchise software is working on an ancient version of Java, right, you may have to figure out, okay, what do I do about this thing that I can't fix? I don't really want to accept the risk because it's like a horrible hole in my security. What do I do with that? And then you'll have to put a compensating control in place. Like as an example, maybe you stick that application and you virtualize it, right? So in any case, as providers, this process that I'm describing, that is the thing you should be packaging up and selling to your customer. And best practice these days is to set an SLA, draw a box around that, and charge your customer for that service. This is an ongoing service. This is not a thing you do once or best effort. This is a thing where you contract with the customer to hold the level of risk acceptance at a line in the sand, and they accept everything that's lower risk, and everything above that you're on contract to resolve. And people will pay for this, and they'll pay a lot more than they will for vulnerability scans because insurers are demanding it. So anyway, that's the 101 of vulnerability management. I happen to have some service providers on today. So are you guys seeing increasing demand for this in your client base?
In different ways. It's not just, they're not using the words, right? Because they don't know the words to necessarily use. So it's a little bit different. We have one gentleman that his whole world right now revolves around CVEs and what that looks like and who touches what and what are we, fixing on the daily and where's our severity level that we care about, and is it 1, is it 2, is it, it all depends on what the scenario is and who the client is and what it touches.
So this one's topical for today because we're a vulnerability management vendor. Carla's got a few different angles on vulnerability management. So this was a good fit. I think MSPs have been doing vulnerability scanning either for their customers or with their customers for decades before MSPs were called MSPs. But it's not until the standards and insurers, organizations have really been pushing towards defining, well, what should be in a vulnerability management service? What is good vulnerability management? And it turns out it's not scanning. Scanning's not enough. You do need to scan. You need to find all of the vulnerabilities. You need to find them rapidly. You need to discover them wherever they are. But then, and this is the important part, and the part that's sort of new to our industry, is you have to do something about it. So depending on which standard, the best practice is you have to find the vulnerability, decide what you're going to do about it, and then either fix the problem or do a risk accept within a defined SLA. It's usually between 14 days and 30 days is defensible under most security standards. But you don't have to fix everything. You only have to fix whatever's in alignment with your risk decision making. So what this CIS 7.1 control is really speaking to is that you document that process. You decide how you're going to do this. This is define it. You're gonna take a scan. It's going to be weekly. It's going to be daily. Someone's going to be in charge of rating them, reading them, etc. And then you're going to do something about it. Now, 7.1 is just about documentation, but this control group CIS 7 does go into a few other detailed controls around how to risk rate, how to make decisions on what should be fixed and stuff. And certainly if you want to learn more about this, dig into CIS controls, go to the control group 7 and check out that group. Do people care about vulnerability management now? Like what's actually kicking them in the neck? Like why are they buying?
It's become the number one way attackers gain entry. So phishing kind of peaked over vulnerabilities a little bit, but now what we're seeing is attackers are scanning companies. It's really, easy to sit and cheap to sit there and scan companies and look for the ones that you can break into. So that's, I think, why it's coming to the forefront. I think there's an understanding of the way we're remediating is not working. So I think that's another key reason why it's coming up. But if you think about there's a lot of things attackers can do, like you said, with lateral movement, privilege escalation, like what are their goals? Different types of threat actors have different goals, different objectives, but there's a limited number of ways they get in. And vulnerabilities is one of the key ways they're going to get in, no matter what software you're using or what protections you have. It's kind of the main thing that they're going to do. There's other ways, insider threat, phishing emails, but this is something that actually you could really make a big difference on with a good patching cadence.
Sure. First thing, they need to know that vulnerability management nowadays is required. It's not optional anymore. If you have any customer that's trying to meet any compliance framework, I mean, literally any one of them, or wants or has cyber liability insurance, and you don't have vulnerability management, right there, you're done. You've just assumed all the risk for that customer because they're requiring it. What's interesting is seeing all the MSPs that confuse vulnerability management and EDR or vulnerability management and SOC or SIEM or whatever. I mean, the reality is, the way I always try to talk about it is, if you're someone who has heart disease in your family, and it's been running there for a while, and you go to the doctor sees, I'm seeing some markers here and there. Here's what I think you need to do. Okay, that's vulnerability management. You take their advice, you do everything you can to protect what you can and address those vulnerabilities. Or you can wait until you have the heart attack and then go ahead and deal with it at that point. And that is EDR. Now, I'm not saying you don't need both. You need both, because if something happens, you need to be able to address it. But vulnerability management is incredibly important. And, Node words into it for the long haul, especially the way we go about it.
So I hear a lot people confusing vulnerability management with other things. There's confusing it with EDR, right? Or MDR, or whatever you want to call the endpoint product that's looking for indicators of compromise, right?
Mhm.
But there's also penetration testing, there's red teaming, there's inside vulnerability management versus outside vulnerability management, network scanning versus agent scanning versus like what's an authenticated scan. There's a lot of terminology here that's misunderstood, and it does matter. And some of these things are actually on the insurance forms.
Mhm.
And if you don't know what some of these questions mean, I mean, you may think you know the answer, and then you get caught out in a claim, and all of a sudden, yeah, you're the bad guy who didn't do the thing, or filled out the form wrong, or told your customer to fill out the form wrong, right?
Well, then you also have customers that are filling out the forms without their MSPs.
Yeah.
I mean, I love that, one of the things I'm finding is MSPs more and more have not been involved in that process. They're not proactively saying, hey, do you have a cyber liability policy? Hey, do you want a cyber liability policy? And becoming involved in that and making sure that what the customer's checking off is true. Because as you just stated, you can check off anything you want, but when it comes time, if they find that that wasn't correct, they're never paying out. And furthermore, the insurance companies now are going, oh, you want this? And if you're not bringing your MSP to the table, they're sending out their MSP into your account. I mean, that's not fear, uncertainty, and doubt. I've heard of it on 20 occasions where an insurance company has their own people they deal with, and they're sending them out because the other MSP didn't say anything or the customer didn't say anything.
So, clearly the MSP's got some responsibilities here. What is best practice right now? It's doing vulnerability management instead of not doing it, right? But can we get a little more specific? Like what are insurers and regulators expecting? This this changes from year to year, right? But let's just talk about like quarter 2 23. What is best practice literally right now?
So best practice, and I'm not just plugging us, whether you use us or use someone else, all of these frameworks and insurance providers are moving to continuous vulnerability scanning, internal and external. And the reason for that is, most products right now, you have to get a box. You have to plan it on a night or weekend. You have to put the box scans, bring back the box. Now you're working off reports for the next 3 days, trying to put something together for the insurance or audit or even your customer. And that means if you're doing it quarterly, someone has had 90 days to penetrate that vulnerability and get in there and cause a problem. And the average time once someone gets into your network, I'm sure you guys know this is what you do, it's 212 days right now before they're ever caught. So with continuous vulnerability,
a long time.
What's that?
That's a long time.
Oh yeah, that's a long time, and they can do
really
lots of
long
havoc. And so what continuous vulnerability scanning does is it notifies you of all the vulnerabilities you have every 24 hours. So those critical alerts will pop up and you'll be able to jump on them immediately, hopefully before anybody has the chance to exploit them in any way, shape, or form. And it's constantly running and notifying you of those critical vulnerabilities as they happen. So you can imagine why insurance and compliance frameworks love this, because of the fact that there is no 30 days to get in there. There is no quarter to get in there. Boom. 24 hours old the information is.
Wait, let's back up a little bit. You talked about 200 days that an attacker could be in the network, but they're not like everywhere in the network for 200 days, right? They're like one place, and then what do we call this lateral movement right through the network? They have access to one thing, then they get access to something else, and then they escalate privilege, and then they do more lateral movement, right? In each of these times, there's lateral movement, right, or privilege of escalation. Many of these points that they're moving through the network, they're taking advantage of vulnerabilities, right? So when you stop those vulnerabilities, or at least you use some kind of SLA to target, the really bad things, right? The really bad vectors. you're not necessarily keeping the attacker out of every system on the network, right? But you're isolating them, right? That's defense in depth, right? You're stopping them where they are. And yeah, they may be on that machine for 200 days undetected, but they're only on that machine 200 days, right? And they're not crawling around extracting stuff from everywhere. And that's critically important. And that's the reason why we do the continuous scanning. And it's everywhere, right? Not just the surface, because
Correct.
a lot of people have been doing surface scans forever, right? Network scans, or they've been doing either their outside network surface, or they drop, like you said, a sensor on the network, and they just they shoot it across the network, but everything's got a firewall on, and they're like, oh, it looks clean, right? And so, but that's not enough, right? We need to get.
There's an importance to having, both a sensor to pull down the infrastructure, right? Because a lot of people skip that step. You're not scanning the routers, the switches, even the IoT devices for that matter.
Pain point, right? Not just from the MSP perspective, which is sort of like, okay, how do I make a process about this? How do I do this on an ongoing basis? How do I get the customer to pay for it? How do I make money while I'm getting the customer to pay for it? Like, those are all the MSP pain points, right? But if we go to the end customer pain point, right? Attackers are breaking into networks, right? They get access to one asset, and then they either escalate their privileges, or they move across a network between assets to another asset. When they escalate privilege, that's just called privilege escalation. When they move around between assets, that's called lateral movement. And they do this combination of things: lateral movement, escalation, lateral movement, until they get to whatever their goal is. And the goal may be download the customer database. It may be take down an oil pipeline. It may be like crypto lock everything in the company or steal all the data. Like, there's a lot of different end goals, right? But that action that an attacker's taking to further their breach, right? It depends on these chains of vulnerabilities. And even if they get into a system using a credential misuse, they are then leaning on vulnerabilities throughout a customer's environment to move around and do the things they're trying to do. So the problem statement: cyber insurers have woken up to this fact. They're getting smarter, right? So they are now saying on their insurance forms, they're not just saying, are you doing vulnerability scanning? Which it used to be like, if you did a scan once a year, that was like enough and you could check the box. And now it's, are you doing vulnerability scanning on a continuous basis? And are you using a risk rating system to determine how to manage your vulnerabilities? And sometimes they even have refinements from there. And those are basically in alignment with what the standards are saying.
The number of vulnerabilities that are getting discovered. And this is why I think, like, to your point earlier, like, why are we talking about this so much more? Like, because we're finding so many more vulnerabilities. Now, what that 0.5% reference is we've got several thousand vulnerabilities discovered each year. Our research says 0.5% are ever actually exploited. So we have all these theoretical ways that we can breach different software and breach your systems, but actually we don't need that many. Like, we need a tiny, tiny amount. And when you see that number, and then when you break that down into, like, well, if it's only 0.5%, how many do I actually need to care about? The difference is really staggering. So a lot of people, the general way of, like, the typical way you do it is, hey, if it's a CVSS score of 7+, I'm going to patch it. When you start looking at it in terms of, like, what's exploited or exploitable and likely to be exploited in the future, you cut your workload by about 65%. It's like a crazy, crazy amount of time you can save while not really accepting any more risk.
Give everybody the basic on vulnerability versus exploit versus threat, just in case we have anybody that doesn't know. So when you're saying exploit, and you're also saying only a very, very small percentage of these massive amount of vulnerabilities that we're finding are exploited, there are going to be people that just by nature don't know what that means. And I think that it helps put it in frame for people when they do know what it means. So if you don't mind, do that for everybody.
Yeah, and it's worth noting, just to add on to what Zach said, I think most of our listeners know what those words mean,
Yep.
but there's a technical definition in cybersecurity, and that's the important bit.
Yeah, do you know what there is? Because vulnerability, like lots of things are a vulnerability. Like what I'm talking about are CVEs, like those actual software vulnerabilities. But even I do it. I use the word, people are a vulnerability, right? Like I use that word interchangeably. So like this is that CVE definition. And this may be dumbing it down a little too far. This is like how I've introduced it to interns and marketing, but I like to think of it like
well, it's like the 0.5. What is that the CISA Kev list? Like, where's that number?
That's coming from Orpheus Research, but
okay.
we do use the CISA Kev list as part of. It's not the only thing we use, but that's part of what we use as our ground truth.
Yeah, and the backstory here is like attackers only use that many vulnerabilities because that's all they need, right? Like they don't build another attack chain if they don't need another attack chain. But if you do block sort of like their normal attacks using targeted vulnerability management, right? You're just going to be the hardest nut to crack. They're not going to build a new attack chain just for you, you know?
Well, and it's hard to build a new attack chain. It's hard to create an exploit. So rather than creating another exploit, they'll just go to the guy that didn't patch the known to be exploitable vulnerability. And that's where the value is for the market, is be the person that's in the know that patches the stuff that people are taking advantage of.
Right, like the Move It vulnerability. I feel like that has been everywhere in the community for weeks. And yet I'm still hearing, oh, we just got hit by Move It. Like,
well, so I'm a member of multiple ISOs, right? And my inbox gets inundated with, okay, we think this one's really scary because, I get early notice and I pay attention to it because it's my business to pay attention to it. But if you're not in the business of vulnerability management, if it's just one of the things you need to do in your business, right?
and also,
I mean, I guess that's what the value of your product is, right?
I mean, yes, like, but those things, like, I get those updates too, and I'm like, dang, I'm overwhelmed with all these emails. And if I've then got to go check, like, do I even have this vulnerability? Like, do I care about it? Do I even have it? Like, that's a lot for a person to do. That is, do you actually?
Not to mention, do all of my clients have that vulnerability, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
and in a lot of cases, we have no idea. As a service provider, it's like, I don't know. They didn't pay me to work on that thing.
Yeah, it's a lot to keep up with. So, yeah, I mean, maybe if we move on to the next slide, I'm going to talk about why CVSS is like not a good way to do it. And this is the way a lot of people tell me they do it, if they even get that far, right? If they get to that point, like to your earlier point, oh, we scan it and then we do X, it typically looks like, well, we're looking at what the CVSS score is. So the CVSS score is a severity score. Doesn't take into account whether it's exploited or not, whether like a code exists to exploit that, or whether it has been exploited. It doesn't change. Like, it's not dynamic. It's not like, hey, you score a 6 and then the day it gets exploited, it's suddenly a 9. Like, it is what it is. It's theoretical severity. And it's actually really slow when you start looking at how long it takes from like that number being reserved to the like CVE being announced, what it is, and like that score being assigned. It could be several weeks, and not everything moves so quickly as like some of them do, like a move it kind of speed, but it's pretty slow. So when you have got those move it type vulnerabilities, CVSS can't really keep up. Like, doesn't take into account anything about, and that they do have a way for you to go and do some manual work for like, well, it sits on this asset and I care about this asset more than I care about this one. But if this is like your baseline of prioritizing, it's just hugely problematic.
Well, what are the better things for us to use?
Should I hit the button?
Yeah, it's probably next slide.
Yeah. Well, I think the next slide is me talking about
Yeah.
Well, what's wrong with it, Carla?
What is it? What is it? Like, it's a score. What is it? That's the question.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, like there you go. There's more things that I didn't even complain about. Like we don't know, like do any threat actors even care about that vulnerability?
I have the penetration testing versus vulnerability management discussion with a handful of people every single week, and it's changed over time. I think there was a period of time when vulnerability management was frankly pretty weak because you scan a network and you have a bazillion results, and what do you do about it? If you got 30,000 vulnerabilities and 15,000 of them are high, how do you focus? I think in the last couple of years, the tools to make that process much easier and more focused has made vulnerability management a lot more powerful. On the other side, penetration testing, people for a long time used to sell those simple vulnerability scans as a penetration test. Technically, it's a type of penetration test, right?
Still do.
It's an enumerative penetration test, right? But penetration testing is like a category, and there's different types of things in that category. And when you use the word penetration test, you should be looking at probably multiple tools in that toolbox. But for years, there's been products out there that have increasingly automated this, but they're button pusher platforms, right? And I don't know if the penetration test label is any more valid for those than the vulnerability scan, right? Where it's looking at a piece of the puzzle and there's not humans involved. But you guys have that little OSCP label on your name. What's going on here in the market right now? These definitions are changing every day.
Yeah, a lot of thoughts. Something that Michael and I go over on a daily basis. Kind of to set the stage, though, the way that I usually explain it to people, and the difference in the two of them is with the analogy of the vulnerability management is it's like health, right? It's like taking care of yourself, working out, eating well, taking time away from work and things like that, right? So those are things you're doing on a daily basis, right? So you're scanning, you're patching, you're fixing things. But once a year, right, you go to the doctor, right? And you go to that doctor and they take a deeper look in. What's going on? Is there anything that you could have missed, right? Because the truth about pen testing too is that you can do everything in vulnerability management well, traditional vulnerability management well, and people and attackers can still get in. So there's a lot of different definitions for it, and it has changed over the years. I think people are starting to get a better idea that what a manual pen test is actually, an objective driven exercise to gain access to a certain system or certain types of data, rather than just scanning for vulnerabilities and potentially exploiting those things and calling that a pen test. I'll stop there and kind of just kick it over to Mike. But yeah, I've all sorts of thoughts on this.
Yeah, no, I agree completely, Teddy. And back to Matt, when you were going over the CIS control, it is really building up those security controls. And then once a year or however frequent you want to test those things, you do a point in time exercise to really validate that those controls are in place. When it comes down to, automated means of pen testing or scanning versus what is the difference between with an actual human behind the keyboard. One of the first things that I'll try and explain to a client or someone looking to do a pen test is try and break down their attack surface. So I think you were alluding to this again, Matt, when you were going through the CIS control. With how decentralized everything is, a lot of organizations have, third-party applications that host critical information. They have cloud resources all over the place. They have user VPN logins to their VPN portals to their physical network. They have, cloud-based access portals, right? So breaking those things down, outlining and helping organizations understand their attack surface, where their weaknesses could lie is really kind of the value that, goes beyond just doing something from an automated means. So it's like, when I'm an external threat and I'm an external pen tester, I'm going to look for all information that I could use to, build my way up, to build an attack, to try and get more information, get into more systems, or get into their physical network or physical systems, right? So I think that's where a lot of the difference lines.